Hey everybody. If you're listening or if you're watching this video, you are on the ground floor of what will ultimately be the podcast History Comes Alive with Jeff Nichols. It's a concept that we've been working through for about 2 years and talking openly for about 18 months. So I know quite a few of you out there have been waiting quite a while. The concept itself has probably been coming on for about 20 years for me, so I'm probably more excited than you are. We've got a ton of content. We've got a ton of really cool stuff planned for at least the first 9 to 12 months once we launch, which will be very soon. I wanted to put forth a couple of videos the next few weeks, maybe shorter format, kind of give you an idea of how I want to present the podcast. It's a podcast on American history, but it's also a podcast about critical thinking. And so we want to take some of the names and places and dates and things that we're all familiar with and kind of open those up a little bit and really try to understand why things happened the way that they did, who are the major players, because oftentimes, believe it or not, the history that's been handed down to us has been sanitized. We want to kind of unsanitize it. We want to present a bold, naked history about the people and the places and the events that all of us have inherited in this generation. And so for this particular question, my question here today is, what is the purpose of government? Now, in a general sense, we could have a lot of different answers. I'm sure there's more than one that's correct, but I want to kind of distill this down, and we want to take a look at it in the concept of the constitutional republic that we live under today. We do not live in a democracy. We live under a constitutional republic. And so there are reasons why we have some of the policies and some of the things that we do and some of the things that we ought to be expecting as citizens of the United States of America. So it's an interesting question, especially if you're able to kind of move past your own personal biases. I have personal biases as well. But if you're really able to consider the weight of that question, what is the purpose of government? Lives hang in the balance with the answer to that question. And it's an important question all of the time. I think about it constantly. But as we find ourselves in the height of the coronavirus and this pandemic, not just on a local or regional or statewide or national, but really on a global scale, it's a good time to reflect once again, what's the purpose of government? One of the general answers that I usually use to help me frame my argument when I'm assessing policies in general is that the government, the purpose of the government is to protect the people from evil or from evildoers. The purpose of the government should be to protect us from evil or evildoers. Put another way, the purpose of the government is to help to facilitate order and expectation within our society. When we answer that question in that way, what's the purpose of government then? To protect us. If we're looking at it to protect us from evil or from evildoers, then it's very important that we begin to define then what protection actually is. How do we define protection? And what is evil? What's an evildoer? Who commits evil? So in the first place, I mean by protection, are we talking about physical protection, emotional protection, economics? Is it limited to just our personal bodies? Or by protection, are we talking about personal property? Consider that carefully. Before we answer that question, we have to understand, as we live in a civil society, are you willing to extend the same protection to those that you may not agree with? The second consideration then is that of evil. What is evil? Is evil static or dynamic? Does the definition of evil change over time? Is evil theoretical or is it verifiable? I mean, is it even reasonable? Is it possible for the government to protect us from evil or from evildoers? What cost is acceptable to achieve that? What's the return on investment that we all expect as citizens? I mean, But certainly the government can't be everywhere all of the time. So what kind of social contract is in order for the government to carry out its purpose and its objectives? I mean, what's the target that they should be shooting for? Can we deal with evil at all? Those things that would harm us. Now, everything in life is a bell curve, isn't it? I mean, you've got both ends of that curve, and then you've got this rise in the middle. For all intents and purposes, for our society, this is kind of that mass of the population. It would seem most prudent then that the purpose of government in the protection of the citizens from evil or from evildoers, realistically in most cases, is really to protect the top of that bell curve where most of the population is. Targeting the outcome that allows for the most liberty and the most opportunity for the most people. Making the majority content. Remember, years ago there was that phrase, it's the economy, stupid. The purpose of our government, is that true, I guess? Is the purpose of our government to make the most people the most content without falling into the tyranny of the majority? That's really what a democracy is, isn't it? The tyranny of the majority. We don't want to live in a society where the tyranny of the majority exists. Historically speaking, those governments never survive very long. The problem is people are fickle. In times of crisis, our own emotions can betray reason, can't they? The the current pandemic that we're experiencing today. How have people been acting? What's happened at the grocery stores? Likewise, in times of ease and plenty, we can remain unconscionably calm, disconnected from the needs of other people. We can remain quite callous as long as our own bellies are full. I always think of the dog as a perfect example. You know, a dog by nature can be quite vicious. They can be quite troublesome, especially if they were running in packs. A person would have to go to great lengths to protect themselves from these packs of wild roving dogs, wouldn't they? But the reality is we bring them into our homes and we give them love and affection and heat and beds and toys, and we give them food. We keep their belly full and they're comfortable, and we see that it's almost as if they've changed their nature. These dogs become docile and lovable. They'll even forego aggression towards other animals that they would normally exhibit. They will not eat other animals that they normally would eat as long as we've kept them placated. Oftentimes, that's what we see in our own government. The comfort that's afforded to us, the vast majority on that bell curve, appears to change our nature. It appears to make us not look as callous as we can be, not as hard or disconnected or insensitive. Compliant cooperation. Is that really the purpose of government? To get as many people as we can to be compliantly cooperative? In all honesty, that's what allows each and every one of us to leave our homes every day and go to our places of employment, make our living, and come home in relative safety. Most of us don't leave our houses in fear in the morning that somehow we're going to be accosted as we go about our business. You see what I've done in this discussion? I've moved the question to its logical focus: security. We live between two extremes, don't we? Population control by force and population order voluntarily. Who designs that system? Who designed it and who maintains it? What metrics do they use? Personal convictions, experience, practicality, convenience, expediency? What are the things that must be taken into account for the greater population? I have a friend of mine, he works in a factory. Not a factory. He works in a warehouse. He pulls orders, loads trucks. They sell various paper products. A few years ago, his warehouse was flooded. We had some torrential rains, and the warehouse flooded. And, I believe it was under a few feet of water, and so my friend was out of work for a couple of weeks, and I happened to be talking to him at the time that he was out of work, and he was very, very anxious, very disgusted, frankly, that he was once again out of work. And I said, once again out of work? And he said, yeah, this happens every few years. He said, I wish they would just fix it. These people are idiots. Why don't they just fix the problem? That sounds like a logical question, doesn't it? So I asked him, I said, who is it that makes these decisions? What problems do you want them to fix? What problems do they have to consider? I mean, what's the financial limitation that they have? What's the considerations that they have as far as the environmental impact? What's local zoning got to say about fixing this building? I mean, what are the resources that they have available to them? I mean, in all honesty, they have warehouses across the country. I asked him, if it's this big a problem, what would happen if they just decided to close down? And he kind of looked at me and he was stunned. His mouth dropped a little bit. He said, I don't know. And I said, well, I'm willing to bet that the managers and the owners of the business and those who are running the factory, the CFOs, the CEOs, whoever's involved in this process, they must have weighed some of these options. My friend walked away very quiet, kind of working through that. And so, as you can see, he was really only concerned about what was affecting him at the time. He really didn't take into account the big picture. Oftentimes, that's the lens not only by which we read and experience history, that's the lens by which history has been handed down to us. To the victor go the spoils. We use that type of logic for all sorts of personal decisions every day. But when we apply this approach to American history, we can get a very different feel for what has transpired. Our founders and framers were not simply a primitive form of the modern American citizen. They used a very different set of metrics to make their decisions. Their convictions were based on their personal experiences. Their ideas of practicality and expediency were very different. They had very different points of reference, very different challenges that they faced. Animals, Native Americans, other European communities. All of these things came to bear on how the government was formed that we live under today. The historian Stephen V. Monsma wrote a book, American Politics. I guess it was about 50 years ago now. It's a great book. On the original Constitution and its authors, Stephen Monsma wrote this, quote, in spite of its almost universal acclaim, given the Constitution, a controversy surrounds its original authors. Were they far-sighted statesmen attempting to construct a document based on sound principles of government and aimed at creating the best possible system of government? Or were they narrow-minded politicians attempting to create a government that would best protect their own economic self-interest? That first view was the most prevailing for many, many years. Far-sighted statesmen attempting to construct a document based on sound principles of government. But historian Charles Beard, in his book, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, concluded that the framers were largely motivated by economic self-interest. He argued that almost all the framers came from the landed and commercial classes of their day, and their chief aim was to protect their land and their commercial interests. Now, of note, this would appear true for any people of any time, would it not? Also, the framers were very divided on a variety of issues for a whole host of reasons that we'll get into a little farther down the line, but they were forced to compromise. Those compromises undermined their own self-interest oftentimes. Compromises for the greater good, for the greater contentment, for the greater stability of the population. Paul Johnson, in his A History of the American People, which, by the way, is a fantastic one-volume book on the history of America, he wrote, when he was talking about George Washington's view on interest, personal interest. Washington's a fascinating character we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about in the weeks and months ahead. Johnson said this about Washington's view. Interest was one of the key words in Washington's vocabulary. Men were driven by it, in his opinion. He wrote, quote, "Interest is the only bonding cement. It applied equally to men and nations. Men speculate as they will," he wrote. "They may talk of patriotism, but whoever builds upon it as a sufficient basis for conducting a long and bloody war will find themselves deceived in the end. For a time it may be of itself a push for men to action, to bear much, to encounter difficulties, but it will not endure unassisted of interest." He thought it was the universal experience of mankind that, quote, "no nation can be trusted further than it is bound by its own interest." It's important to grasp that Washington saw both the Revolution and the Constitution making that followed as the work of men driven mainly by self-interest. You see, in times of upheaval, if the philosophical reaction is for just a moment in time, it may well be at the expense of long-term national stability. The weight of the law of unintended consequences can be very heavy. It may even open the door to evil and to evildoers. Those that have committed their own self-interest above the common good. Consider again the words of Stephen Monsma, or Paul Johnson, or Charles Beard, or George Washington, as we've just discussed. Even if these observations are true, that the motives of the founding fathers may not have been as pure as we often like to think, can we still be happy beneficiaries of the system? I mean, let's put this another way. Which of us would design a system that was inherently detrimental to our own self-interest? How and why does all of this work? Why does our government exist? Is it to serve the people? Or is it for the people, or is it to be served by the people? Are we citizens or subjects? What role does the individual play in our society? What's responsible citizenship? Back to our original question then. What's the purpose of government?